All right, good evening, welcome everyone, and welcome to the final night of our year-long series dedicated to Black Atlantic cinema. My name is Vincent Hediger. I teach cinema here at Goethe University, and I am the co-curator of the series together with Didi Chica and Danny Fairfax. And we were also assisted in our work by Faven Heile, who gave us a lot of important input. And we, like the grand finale of the series is basically organized around Med Hondo and the films of Med Hondo, which is a beautiful coincidence. Last week, Abubakar Sanogo, who I think we can say is the world specialist on Med Hondo, came here and presented West Indies, and tonight we get a chance to see Soleil Ô by Med Hondo in combination with Dreaming Rivers, a 30-minute film from 1988. This was the curatorial choice of our guest tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to the combination and how the two films play against and with each other. Our speaker tonight is Awa Konaté, who was born in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark. She earned a PhD in political science and African studies from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and then embarked on a very important curatorial career, which led her, among other places, to the Serpentine Gallery in London, one of the leading contemporary art spaces, not just in London, but in the world. And for 3 years now, that's correct, 2 years. Awa has been based in Abu Dhabi, where she is a curator. Awa Konaté also founded the Culture Art Society, which is an interdisciplinary platform dedicated to the study and dissemination of African arts and culture, with a particular focus on African archives. And that was part of the reason why we here in Frankfurt were very keen to invite her, and we're very happy when she accepted our invitation. As some of you may know, we've been doing a bit of work ourselves in the area of African archives, and to have a conversation with somebody who's done so much important work in this field is a great opportunity. So without further ado, I cede the podium to Awa Konaté. Thanks for being with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I've been told that I have to be mindful of not hitting the microphone, and that is a challenge for someone who's very physically engaged when they speak, but I'll try. It's so good to see you all today, and thank you for joining me and us for this year's, what I understand is the final lecture and screening in the German Film Institute and Goethe University's Black Atlantic program. I should say that I'm not a PhD holder yet, so my degrees are from SOAS and in contemporary art, but I'm moving towards that phase, but we'll get there. I would also like to extend my sincerest thanks to the program curators, Didi Chica, who's somewhere with us in the room today, as well as Fevin, as well as Daniel, and of course Björn of the Film Museum here, as well as Vincent as well for the invitation, but also for their very important and timely curatorial effort in shaping this program. As Vincent mentioned, my name is Awa Konaté. I am currently a curator at Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, also based in the UAE, and I'm also the founder of the research-led curatorial platform Culture Art Society, or abbreviated as CAS, established in 2013. Today, I'll be drawing upon my work, formerly as an independent curator specialized in lens-based practices, who has worked extensively with filmmakers as well as moving image artists, and who continues to draw extensively from Black filmmaking as well as modes of archival engagement and circulation for my curatorial work and thinking. Thus, what I will be presenting today represents my own curatorial work and thinking and not that of the museum that I actually work for. The theme of today's lecture is drawn from the concept of the Black Atlantic, a term coined by British Caribbean scholar Paul Gilroy to describe the transnational intercultural spaces forged through the histories of enslavement, migration, and resistance. I want to deepen this framing by exploring how Black Atlantic cinema may be understood not only geographically and historically, but as an overall framework for this program, also psychopolitically, through V.B. Du Bois' notion of double consciousness, theorized in his seminal 1903 work titled The Souls of Black Folk. The theory's incisive articulation of the fractured self, one oscillating the terrains of invisibility and visibility, simultaneously seen and unseen, hypervisible and yet erased, I argue in my presentation, offers an enduring lens through which we can comprehend the aesthetic and psychological grammar of Black diasporic cinema. Specifically, I'll be looking to two films, Hondos SOLEIL Ô, translating to O Sun in English from 1970, as well as London-based filmmaker Martina Thiel's Dreaming Rivers from 1988. Both films I have curated extensively in the past, both through film programs as well as exhibitions, and I argue very much that each represents distinct and yet interconnected modalities of survival under what Saidiya Hartman has called the afterlife of slavery, or the colonial conditions' lingering psychic and material residues. These two films, emerging from different confluences of the Black diaspora, Hondo from post-colonial Mauritania and later France, and Thiel from the Caribbean-British migration nexus, form a dialectic between confrontation and interiority. Thinking through the semiology of colonial afterlife and its representational forms, Hondo dramatizes the alienation of African immigrants in France, capturing their psychological and material fractures with visceral defiance. While Thiel, through poetic and nonlinear storytelling, mediates on migration, longing, and ancestral memory, thus crafts a language of diasporic subjectivity that centers the haunting tenderness of Black matrilineal memory. With this lecture, I intend to not only present and introduce these films, of course in advance of their screening, but I also want to invite you as the audiences here to reflect on the ways in which diasporic subjectivity within cinematic storytelling opens space for both rupture and imaginative reconstruction, and for us to really think of how, when curated together within a Black Atlantic framework, we're offered a curatorial approach that foregrounds cinema, its visuality and image making as both a continental and diasporic practice. As of African cinema as well as third cinema, Hondos SOLEIL Ô remains, in my opinion, one of the most audacious and incisive critiques of post-colonial disillusionment. Produced independently very much on a shoestring budget, the film was a radical intervention, both formally and politically, emerging at a time when newly decolonized African nations were beginning to confront the myth of post-independent sovereignty and the bitter, truly, realities of neocolonial economic and political entanglements. As has been suggested, the film's title takes on from a lament sung by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, immediately sets the tone of this work. It's a cry of anguish that is both historical as it is transtemporal. Our unnamed protagonist, played by actor Robert Lionsol, journeys from a colonized African country to metropolitan France. This journey is portrayed not as a heroic migration, but as an odyssey into systemic anti-Blackness, Afrophobic erasure, as well as psychic fragmentation. Our unnamed migrant is full of expectation, only to find himself, once in Paris, racially marginalized, economically excluded, and politically disenfranchised. Foregoing the traditional cinema of social realism, this narrative of disillusionment troubles the themes of innocence and corruption, of infantilization and seniority, very much the standard Western diagnoses of Blackness itself. The politically abrasive and stylistically hybrid style is disturbing as it is disjunctive, yet it disassembles the myth of coloniality itself. The central thrust of Hondo's film is the protagonist's descent into social invisibility and psychic dissonance, an experience that folds directly onto Dubois' formulation of double consciousness, or as Dubois notes, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the others. This recursive and effective seeing, or rather eyeing, of oneself is doubled by this dominant gaze where there is the tension between one's own internal self-conception and external appreciation. To be seen but to not be recognized, to be present and yet perpetually othered, becomes a motif through Soleil Ô. Yet this motif is not merely a distortion strictly in the sense of like an inauthenticity where Black subject is completely and irreparably inferior, extending to Dubois' American formulation to the Francophone experience in the film. And I think we should also, of course, note here Frantz Fanon's contribution to the film's thinking. In Soleil Ô, our African immigrant is entrapped within this two-ness that Dubois speaks of both being French and Black, both African and Black, or to echo Dubois once again, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warning ideals and one dark body whose dark strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. In short, the strength of our protagonist, the power and the visual viscerality of Soleil Ô keeps it from being torn asunder. In spite of the madness and the psychic dissonance, both the film and the protagonist will not submit. In one scene, our protagonist attempts to find work and is interviewed by a series of white employers. One of them claims that Africans are better suited to manual labor. Another suggests that people like you must adapt, while a third appears to show interest, asking questions, nodding interestingly, only to then finally dismiss him because of his lack of experience. Dubois describes double consciousness as this sense of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. These interviews in the film unfold as repetitive, absurdist theater, charged with the effective economy of both contempt and pity. Each interaction reinforces our protagonist's position as one who's constantly enduring being seen through the lens of a paternalism that denies him subjectivity, and therefore it also poignantly captures again what Dubois referred to in his book as the veil. It's a psychic screen that doubles how Black subjects are perceived and how they must perceive themselves. It is precisely this staging or this screening of the formal encounter that is the interview that Soleil Ô exposes the very aesthetic and metaphysical operation of what can also be called the interview, as in looking into oneself. For our protagonist, double consciousness is experienced through this racial and psychic drama of the interview, where views, eyes, and gazes are interlinked and interplayed. Yet Soleil Ô turns this interview into a confrontation as an aesthetic and a political strategy. The film subverts the conventions of narrative cinema, its episodic structure intercut with historical vignettes, church sermons, musical numbers, and stage interviews, creating a dissonant collage. And I do really applaud you to pay very carefully attention to the soundtrack of the film, because that's where its power also really lies. It does not offer catharsis or resolution. Instead, it fragments, confronts, disrupts, accurately capturing the process of confrontation, screening the symbolic register of this racial drama. In another poignant scene of the film, a group of white characters appear in a fictionalized television debate discussing the African problem in France. They speak over images of African workers, fetishizing their labor and yet lamenting their failure to integrate. The absurdity of that commentary, delivered in quite serious intellectual tones, is undercut by the visual grammar, which exposes the double bind and thus layers bare the colonial mythos. Here we view the French and European television industry's genre of racial relations. Is media and politics a representation, not simply played out, but playing up the debate? We view the pathos of double consciousness in its televised and mediated broadcast. In Soleil Ô, Hondo makes a quite poignant political agent of the camera by repurposing the apparatus of the camera to confront and impose one's own looking onto and against what European visual culture has made an evident truth. Hondo's camera is no longer a tool of white surveillance, but it is in fact an active vessel for the strategic image making of the colonized subject's defiance. Rather than falling into the affective economy of humanism, so pity and contempt, empathy and redemption, Hondo ruptures the expected trajectory of migrant success, or what Gilroy actually might call the assimilationist performance of the West, by denying us as viewer any emotional comfort or redemptive closure. Du Bois' two-ness is not settled in Soleil Ô. Our protagonist's anonymity and depersonalization, he is never named, are not simply signs of erasure but tools of universality. He becomes every man and yet no man. Towards the end of the film, our protagonist becomes unmoored, angry, and finally militant. In a climactic moment, he screams directly into the camera, "Where is your humanism?" This direct address breaks the fourth wall, transforming spectatorship into confrontation, indicting the viewer and the broader liberal humanist ideology that claims universality while enacting violence upon racialized people. The film's closing scene of our protagonist amongst a group of other black men preparing for some undefined revolutionary act suggests not resolution but resistance. The double consciousness has not been reconciled, but instead the imposition of his two-ness is refused and turned outward, thus becoming a very direct politicized third space of militancy and critique. In marked contrast to Hondo's insurgent tone, Martin Attille's Dreaming Rivers offers a contemplative, elegiac, as one might say, meditation on diasporic life from within the domestic and embodied spaces of Black British as well as British Caribbean life. Attille, a founding member of the Sankofa Film and Video Collective, traces the affective contours of displacement, crafting a film that moves away from direct confrontation, instead towards the quietude realm of interiority, matrilineal memory, and spectral presence. Whereas Soleil Ô creates a strategy for survival, Dreaming Rivers reckons with what it means to be a survivor and what it means for one's children and one's love to survive after your death. Or to put it in another way, or more explicitly, what it means for love to survive the heart. In Dreaming Rivers, love is inextricably related to departure. While a migrant journey is the undercurrent of the film, this journey is more of a longing that privileges opacity, affect, and spiritual transmission. The experience of double consciousness shifts away from the frontal clash with whiteness, as we will view in Soleil Ô, but to the inner turbulence of memory loss and identity. It is not simply self-consciousness that is troubled by double consciousness, but self-love, loving a ghost, and the hauntedness that touches this love for Black women, especially Black women who are mothers. The film centers on Miss T, a Caribbean matriarch lying on her deathbed in her home in England. Her 3 children surround her, yet they remain emotionally tense and temporarily distant. There is no plot in the conventional sense, nor does the film offer any narrative resolution or reconciliation in its processing of pain. Instead, it unfolds in a fragmented, non-linear structure, merging dreams, memory, disembodied voiceover, and visual metaphors to explore a sense of diasporic dissonance where images of water, domestic interiors, family photographs, and the sound of Miss T's voice drifts us between the past and the present. Attille collapses chronological time, instead lingering in the spaces of in-betweenness, between the past, present, homeland and hostland, presence and absence. And so again, to reiterate, this is a tale of longing, not lingering, where temporalities and convergence as it is in disturbance. In one particularly resonant moment at the beginning of the film, we see Miss T alone in her home, standing before a mirror, her body heavy with the weight of fatigue. Her face dissolves into an archival photograph of a younger self, then into an image of a ship on the Atlantic. These transitions are not merely aesthetic by Attille, they evoke the transgenerational transmission of displacement and the persistence of the Middle Passage as a structuring absence in Black Atlantic diasporic life. The rivers of his titles are metaphor for the psychological currents that disperse across generations and geographies. And staying with the title Dream-In conjoins more practice, a memory work that gravitates, pulls, and pushes the currents of these rivers, memories, and stirrings. Dubois' double consciousness resurfaces here in Attil's work as well, but in a very different register. Rather than portraying or screening double consciousness as experience for the singular Black subject, Dreaming Rivers deals with a transgenerational transmission of double consciousness within a Black family, or rather within the sphere of kinship. The encounter here is not an interview as it is in Soleil Ô, but an inheritance, or to put it another way, Dreaming River evokes the heritage of double consciousness as one that is problematized by the figure of Black femininity. It asks, as it probes, how does it feel to be a problem? Such is the tone of how Miss T's children address their dying mother. Each of them speak with British accents of different diasporic positions which enact a temporal splitting. Inherited with loss, longing, and displacement, their culture memory is fractured. They attempt to piece it together, but the fragments do not always fit. They follow a river of thought, a memory a secret, as it breaks forth into countless more streams. It is Miss T who comes to enjoy these moments to her interiority, which occupies multiple spaces and times. She is here in a British house. She's also there in the Caribbean on the ship. She's out of frame, but the foci of the film itself, the film's mystery as the film's secret. Their children live in the imperial center, but are adrift in terms of identity and belonging. One daughter is stern and pragmatic, another resentful, as is the son. Their relationship is strained, unspoken, yet they say things they would not dare say but in this house only. This generational disjuncture is key to the film's exploration of diasporic identity, not as a seamless transition of culture, but as friction, estrangement, and ambivalence. The house is a metaphor, a memoryscape of this inheritance, of this weight, more like the slave ship or like the womb or the heart that is referenced in the work. The entirety of Miss T, housing an inheritance where love, loss, and memory is an uncanny experience. The house then becomes an archive, and by extension, so does the film itself. Its walls are thick with silence, its room filled with ghosts. In yet another scene, we see Miss T's daughter walking through the hallway. Her footsteps echo unnaturally, as if the wall seems to breathe. Photographs flicker, and in the kitchen an old kettle whistles, triggering a flash of Miss T as a young woman laughing at a party. These formal techniques, epileptical editing, sound bridges, superimposition, transform the home into an archive, a place where time accumulates rather than progresses. Attil treats furniture, photographs, lights, candles, and even shadows, not as props but as living witnesses. In yet another poignant scene, we see Miss T seated alone in her living room. The lighting is dim. The walls are covered in family photographs. She gazes silently into space, while the voiceover recalls a memory of arriving in Britain on the Empire Windrush. As she speaks, the image slowly transitions into an archival footage of post-war Britain. Ships docking, men in suits, cold gray skies. But unlike a documentary flashback, this footage is filtered through the soft textures of memory. The soundtrack is layered with ambient sound and a heartbeat-like rhythm. Miss T is both dying and as she is remembering, both present and yet ancestral. The film's voiceover, spoken by Miss T herself, anchors the work in a matrilineal memory. Her memories are not always clear linear, but they persist. They emerge through song and Creole, fragments of speech and glances. This reliance or recalls what Hortense Spillers refers in her concept as a mother of a symbolic vessel in the wake of slavery. She is both a carrier and a transmitter of diasporic meaning. Attil does construct double consciousness not as an external conflict between Black and American, or in this case Caribbean and British, but as an internal bodily archive, a psychic negotiation across time and geography of the recursive loop and tide of memory and fracture. Returning to Dubois' double consciousness in Dreaming River is therefore expanded. It is no longer confined to the binary of the singular self and white gaze, but multiplied across time, across skin, across streams. This is not the double consciousness of rapture alone, but of layering, as it is an archive and as it is an inheritance. The film ends not with Miss T's death, but with a quiet image of her lying still, her eyes closed while her children sit in the adjacent room, silent and uncertain. This moment is neither tragic nor is it resolved. It is a passage, ambiguous, poetic, and open-ended. What she leaves behind is not necessarily clarity, but affective residue. The past affective residue has not passed, it murmurs as it flows and as it dreams. Whereas Soleil Ô ends in political declaration, Dreaming Rivers asserts a ghostly and polyphonic sonic afterlife. Both films resist closure and both offer diasporic survival as persistence, as presence, and as ongoingness. Through Soleil Ô and Dreaming Rivers, we encounter two distinct and yet equally powerful cinematic articulations of Black Atlantic life. One confronts quite incisively the gaze of whiteness with biting irony, militancy, and refusal. The other turns inwards to reckon with memory, loss, and matrilineal time. Both resist closure. Both are alive and live within the friction of double consciousness as alienation, as archive, but also as awakening. Soleil Ô and Dreaming Rivers also contend with double consciousness of Black curation. Du Bois' Soul of Black Folk was essentially arguing that the African American is made to view themselves as both Black and American, though paradoxically this is not fully recognized by the white citizenry. I have spoken about this two-ness regarding the Francophone migrant experience and matrilineal Black-British kinship. Though double consciousness is also a thematic for us as cinema-goers and programmers to view how such films are eyed as both Black and cinema. In my closing remarks, I want to consider this further by saying that to curate Black Atlantic cinema is not simply to gather films made by African or Afro-diasporic practitioners. Black Atlantic cinema is not and should not be indexical. It is to enter into a political relationship with memory, with rupture, and aesthetics, to treat cinema not as a commodity or document, but as a living itinerant form of world-making that is fragmented, non-linear, hybrid, improvisational, and deeply situated in historical and affective geographies. The films of Hondo and Martina Thiel, while drastically different in tone, texture, and form, demonstrate the polyvocality and heterogeneity of diasporic cinematic expression, and thus they require curatorial strategies that can hold contradiction, asymmetry, and silence alongside sound, militancy alongside meditation. In doing so, they also insist that we, as audience goers and as curators, think of Black Atlantic cinema not as a category, but rather as a practice, an active and relational engagement with the diasporic condition. While it is, of course, important to insist that Soleil Ô and Dreaming Rivers are works of cinema for their recognition and distribution, equally it is important to insist that they are also works of memory. Works of image making. It is vital such as films are screened in cinema such as the German Film Institute where we find ourselves today. Yet when we appreciate that these films enact theater, restage television, and activate archives, we also see how cinema is not only the only house for their screenings. As works of Black aesthetics, for the experimentation they produce and the intimacy they offer, they go beyond the realm of cinema itself. Working within a visual culture of modernity, migration, and diaspora, they are cultural productions that screen the experience and practice of both confrontation and rememory as we curators must draw upon. So I think I will conclude there and invite us to see the films, and hopefully you will leave today with some poignant questions to yourself and the work, and perhaps what I've touched upon in my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for bringing the two films together and screening them for us in this venue. And as you said, Black Atlantic cinema is a process, a practice, and not a category. And it is a memory. And what was really fascinating here is to bring together the various spaces that these films call up. The first film references Santa Lucia and the Caribbean, the Afro-Caribbean diaspora whereas the Mad Hondo film is very much about the France-Afrique diaspora and the changes that it brings to French society. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more what motivated the choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I addressed in my presentation, I was very, very interested in what it means to think about the Black Atlantic from two very, very different perspectives and yet quite interconnected engagements around this theory, but also this lived embodied experience of a geography and of a culture and of a process, a political process as well. You know, Hondo's work is so much more biting, and it's very much a confrontation with I mean, both the politics of whiteness itself, but also everything that underpins the Black Atlantic, but from a perspective of trying to not name a character specifically, but employing a character as a point of departure to think about these political relationships. Whereas I think Martina Thiel's work, it's so poetic in its slowness, because it's not as politically incisive as Hondo's work is in its confrontation. It turns much more inwards. And I was interested in what it means for certain cultural practitioners of African descent who are thinking about the Black Atlantic in their work, but looking at it as a process of pain that is very, very poetic and very slow-paced, and particularly gives attention to the experience of motherhood in the context and of in the Black Atlantic, and what that particular history has also meant for histories around displacement, but also kinship and family bonds as well. And I think that film does it so beautifully because it grapples with the difficulties and the complexity and the nuances of this history, but looking to that from the perspective of motherhood. And for me, I found those two juxtapositions to be so important, because while, you know, we understand the Black Atlantic from a particular mid-Hondo-esque, you know, purview as far as it's theorized, but I don't, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but from my experience of also researching leading up to this, I found that actually a lot of theorizing or thinking around the Black Atlantic has not necessarily been in the process of motherhood, but also Black femininity. Yes. It's been very particular US Black studies discourse with thinkers like Hortense Spillers and Sadiet Hartman, of course, but in the framework of filmmaking, it's actually quite underexplored. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, in the Mad Hondo film, there's only one Black woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was actually asking myself whether it was not Sarah Mulder, because she looks like her a bit, but there's only one Black woman at one point in the background, but she's pregnant. Mm-hmm. Whereas the first film is as you said, very much about motherhood. I was also thinking about the role of mirrors in the two films. Like in the first film, the mirror is a key element, and it is a figuration of the broken identity, the Du Bois double consciousness figure. Whereas in the second film, the mirror is associated with white femininity. It's basically just white women looking at themselves in mirrors that we see. And that's very important for the film, the kind of the way it depicts a certain type of white femininity, but there's also an inventory of white femininity. I mean, there's the classic concierge character, the sort of racist gatekeeper in the apartment house, and the kinds of discourses that they have. Yeah,
but I think also the mirroring in the second film is, I mean, of course, it's a reflection of how whiteness like circulates in the film, but I also feel the mirroring in the second film is very interesting because it's the very key element for our protagonist's awakening. The longer that you spend seeing yourself truly in the eyes of the other in this context, the more quicker you come to your awakening of who you actually are and what you embody in and what position you take in the space or where you find yourself. Worrell said in the first film, the mirroring itself was her looking through herself through the eyes of her children.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's the generation ring as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have questions or statements from the audience? Anyone want to jump in and say something? Yes, Didi, please.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that fine presentation and for selecting this film. This is like a fitting end to this second leg of this presentation. So, you are like maybe, I don't know, of female presenters in this series. So there has been Awa Konaté, and there has been and I think one of the critiques of Gilroy is his exclusion of black female voices in the Black Atlantic.
Absolutely.
So, and maybe have a big inadvertently, when we draw up the program, you also included quite a number of female voices, so we could hear different perspectives. So and oh yeah, there was Janina also, and the other critique of Gilroy's was his exclusion of Africa. And also when we began the last fall, when we made the program, we also screened Ola Balogo's Adeosa Negra, which was the first feature film made by a black person in Brazil, because the concept of the Black Atlantic always seemed to exclude the South American, seemed to privilege only the North American experience and also. And yeah, I'm curious about curious about this dig, which it seems that Hondo is giving at Aimé Césaire and those blacks. So those black poets who talk about negritude, drinking red wine inside the expensive salons of the 16th arrondissement. So, and yeah, it's part observation and part maybe you do you think maybe some little bit of elaboration maybe regarding the aspect of critique of in this film, critique of actually the concept of negritude and how it has been sort of monetized or careerized by certain black negritude poets in France. Because I think also what is missing in this course of the Black Atlantic is the terrible attitude of France towards black people. There is always this focus on UK and the US, but I think there are some really terrible attitudes, part of the concept of assimilation and also France actually has a very terrible attitude towards black people, and maybe you want to say a little bit something about that.
Thank you for your question, Didi, and for actually bringing these quite poignant remarks and observations about the film. It is quite accurate that I think also going back to Vincent's point and why I chose these two films, I wanted to anchor the voice of and the experiences of black women and how people think around the Black Atlantic. And for that reason, Martina Thiel's work was very, very important to that context. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, even in the context of filmmaking, this is still very less explored and less as imminent in the scholarship as, say, it is from a very particular kind of like cis hetero male perspective as we see in Hondo's film. That to answer the first question. The second is quite interesting that you're saying that, because I have not necessarily thought of a negritude-esque analysis of Hondo's work, but it of course speaks to that. But I think Hondo's work, it does not come with that same kind of polished idea of speaking to the colonizer in a language that is familiar to the colonizer, right? In the way that I think the negritude poets would. It's very eloquent, it's very particularly composed in a way, and it still speaks with the same political force. But I mean, in my opinion, I'm not sure if Hondo's work is a critique. I mean, of course, critiques could be drawn to negritude in the work that, in the sense that our character is so blinded by by really the force of this colonial brainwashing, that they do not actually see the violence that they're being subjected to. Hence why our character in the film says, but we share the same ancestor as the goal, and this is my home as much as it is yours. And in time he begins to see his awakening that is much more radical, but his awakening is not one that wants to insist and prounce his pride of his blackness. It's more that actually he's in confrontation with this system, and his confrontation with the system is that he wants to break it completely and sever it. And so could one say that this is an alternative reading of negritude? Yes. Could one also say that it is a critique of, not a critique, sorry, but rather a different form of thinking around Black relations in France? Absolutely. But I think also, sorry, if I just follow your question and going to the other point about the Black Atlantic and France, it's interesting. France is very much still part of the Black Atlantic discourse, but I think because the Anglophone sphere dominates what we understand as the Black Atlantic, as people sort of forego France's role, there's been a lot of writing and theorizing by Francophone writers from the 60s, from the 70s, looking to France's history and the ongoing contingencies and the continuities of that history today. And they do so. But to say that France is not part of that, I'm not sure if I would agree. I think it's more so with the crossover of the languages, where there is still very much a gap, almost in the institutional understandings of the Black Atlantic, if that's what you're alluding to in your point. Because if you read a lot of French scholarship, it's very much there, where people are looking to France's role. Sorry, can you just remind me about the last part about your question?
I thought maybe you touched practically on them also. Mm-hmm. Maybe, but to clarify, I was not excluding France from there. I said that the tendency among majority discourse on the Black Atlantic is a tendency to focus only on the North Atlantic, while ignoring the actual impact of French society also on that. So I'm thinking, because I can't recall, I'm feeling that maybe probably at least you have responded to this, because I've seen there's the interview conducted by Marie Good Ballet, and Hondo always keeps coming back to Aimé Césaire. So he seems to have an issue with Aimé Césaire, and it was in the text on the screen when you talked about the poet of negritude, so was it to white people, so and all that. But since I have the mic, maybe I could go on a little bit more to this. Could you connect? Maybe I don't know how familiar you are with the second generation Breton. So this on the works of like the first film, I'm seeing how it can relate it to the works of the Black Audio Collective in UK, the works of John Akomfra, Coco Fusco, Isaac Julian, who seemed to be the associate director in the first film. So in the first film, could you connect it within that experience of that generation of Black people in the UK, the first film you screened? So
yeah, absolutely. So Martina Till was a co-founder of the Sankover Film Collectors, where Isaac Julian was also a member, and she was a very, very close friend of several of the quite big artists that we know today of Black British arts, like John Akomfa, as well as Sonia Boyce, who was actually the set designer for Dreaming Rivers. And and I'm glad that you're actually bringing up the point of France, and I now return to what I wanted to say. You see, France is articulated in both of the films quite differently. In Hondo's film, it's much more through the France-Afrique relationship, as Vincent mentioned, and in Martina Till's film, it's France in the context of a particular kind of Black British Afro-Caribbean experience from St. Lucia. And so you still see France as a common thread between these two films, going back to France's presence in the Black Atlantic as well. But with that generation with that work that we're talking about, it emerges in the 80s at a very particular context of the migration experience in the UK. I mean, the hostility of that time in the 80s, coming out of a coming out of an incredibly politicized and quite disenfranchised context of Black artists working in the UK in the 80s. They were being excluded from institutions, excluded from being able to articulate the modalities and notes of their work, and very much also grappling with the same questions as their peers in the US were, as their peers in France also were at the time, but also being able to look at these complexities in their work that is, I think, maybe as not as politically aggressive as it might be today, because you see artists being much more direct about how they deal with the complexities of their afterlife and with migrations and displacement and these complexities around familiar issues. But the way that Martina Till articulated, and I think many artists in the 80s did, they found these subtle strategies to be able to articulate in their work. You see Martina Till's work and it's deeply political, but you would not be able to immediately detect that upon seeing the work, because you think, oh, it's about a family history and pain around family history. And what I find so interesting about the work is that it deals and grapples with racism, but the word racism is not mentioned once, for example. And yeah, I think I'm going to answer your question there in that way. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, yeah, Gladys, I'm bringing the microphone up.
I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have, I don't think they're questions per se, but more things that I picked up when you were presenting before the films. You mentioned something I found very interesting. You said in one film, there was an accumulation of time rather than progression. And then looking at the juxtaposition of the two movies, in one movie you can sort of see it, the just accumulating of time into one room. And then in Hondo's film, there's a very quick progression of what that time is that ends up in what is a chaotic reaction to realizing that time has moved really quickly. And then the second point would be towards, but I'm very happy that you brought up John Okonfra, because that's who I was going to recommend, with this idea of migration, assimilation, and so forth. I don't know if you know about his show, Listening to the Rain Through the Night. And it's very much, that's his show at the Venice Biennale for the British Pavilion last year. Yeah, last year. And it's very much looking at these ideas of migration from Africa into different kinds of places, of course with a very heavy focus on Britain. But it does speak to kind of a lot of interesting complexities, I think, would be interesting to you as well. And also in relation to the archive and memory and all these kinds of complications of time when it accumulates and then it doesn't accumulate and then it's kind of, yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about artists engaging with accumulation and layering of time in their work without mentioning someone like John Okonfra, specifically in the context of filmmaking, as that's really been core to his work. I mean, Martina Till also emerges from that very same context of artists working in the 80s that are very interested in overturning the very understanding of filmmaking and doing it very differently. She's not as documentary and as archive heavy as John Okonfra is, but nevertheless she deals with filmmaking itself as an archival modality. Whereas I think John draws on archival material to be able to juxtapose that thinking in his work. But nevertheless, there are two, again, a different strand of Black Atlantic cinema emerging from a very different practitioner that's also quite interconnected to a lot of the things that have been shared and shown and illustrated in these two films. Yeah. And I will also say that actually, if you want to see a work by John that deals that very interestingly, is actually his first ever film called Signs of Empire from 1986 that deals that. It was the Black audio film collectives, her first ever released work, I think does that quite beautifully. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. We saw tonight some Catholic motives in both movies, and my first question would be the church in one of the very first scenes. Where was it meant to be located? Was it in Africa, or was it already in France? And my second question is, does the main actor represent any certain Atlantic country? We saw that suitcase with many stickers, so I presume he represents all of the Atlantic countries. Would you agree on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think what I said during my lecture is that our protagonist unnaming and mit Hondo's film is the strength of the film, because he is no man and yet he is every man. So he embodies every single person and yet he embodies no one. Now the location of the church itself, my reading of the film that it was in this unnamed city somewhere on the continent, and that we don't know where, because we see him migrating and arriving in France. So yeah, that's how I would observe that. Unless I read a different film than you.
Yeah, Gladys. Coming back up. It's a good exercise, you know.
I don't know. I would read the church as being in France because of the multiple migrants. You know, because I kind of feel like the film focuses on their migration from different places into France. Because you've got the Togolese and you've got the Congolese and somebody from Mali. I don't know.
But but I don't think necessarily that migration would only occur in the context of them being in France, because you also have, if there was a specific historical context to all of these different ethnic groups being placed in one context, it may perhaps also allude to what they were saying when our protagonist was having the interview with the white man who somewhat embodied both a psychologist as he did an analyst, where they're talking about how it's so much easier to enforce a process where people are vetted and then kind of shipped almost as through a factory process. And you do have specific cities and contexts on the continent where there are different communities that are living together and then also await migration arrival to France. So for example, Senegal has an extensive history of that, so does Côte d'Ivoire as well. So, but I think that's the beauty of the film, is that it does not place that location very directly to you, and it remains ambiguous, but at the same time, the critique of that position and that relation of power nevertheless doesn't change, irregardless of where the location actually is. But I think people have different interpretations of it. Yeah.
Yes, I think for me the power of that scene,
yeah,
I accept it as this. It's symbolism. It's symbolic.
It's the symbolism.
I will not want to place it because colonialism had the effect of destroying the cultures of colonized people everywhere it set foot. In trying to say, oh, that your religion, I quite remember in primary school being told that my own the language is vernacular, that you shouldn't speak it. So it was an offense to come and speak it in the British educational system. So you have to speak their proper language and leave your own language behind. So I think the scene speaks to the effect of colonialism, of destroying the cultures of colonized people as being inferior, while actually at the same time stealing those same culture, and at the same time giving people, raising people's identity and giving them new names. So I will actually accept that scene on a symbolical level, not in its physical. So yes, I think it works for me too.
Yeah, because I mean, as you also see with the film, they actually say, forgive me for speaking my native tongue before they're baptized and then renamed into these Western French names. So I mean, of course, could we try to place the location of where that church is if we really wanted to? Yes, but I don't think it's necessary to do that to understand what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I find fascinating about Matt Hondo's film is that there is the symbolic and the allegorical dimension, and but then sometimes it goes down to the strictly documentary and the social experiment. I mean, the black man and the white woman in the street as a provocation for the kind of reactions that they then record on the camera and show in the film is that's not symbolic. that is a social experiment. You know, it basically triggers on camera racism of the most conspicuous and despicable kind. And then some of the details seem a bit allegorical, but are very specific, like the Swedish delegate who comes in with money that is supposed to go to African migrant workers, and the union doesn't have an account for them. And that's very reminiscent of things that also happened in the 30s when the left-wing Popular Front government basically endorsed colonialism and left organizations like l'Étoile Nord-Africaine to their own devices and were not willing to allow the anti-colonial struggle to be joined to left-wing politics. So there's a long history of that in France, and actually, quite frankly, in the European workers' movement.
I mean, Aimé Césaire left the French Communist Party because of how much racism he experienced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
As did Matt Hondo as well.
Yeah. And so some of the diagnosis of contemporary France as turned to the right wing is historically blind because the Communist Party, like if you read Georges Marchais' speeches from the 1970s and 80s, he sounds like Le Pen, quite frankly, on migration, exactly like Le Pen. Danny, sorry.
Just going back to this opening scene, I mean, I absolutely agree with Didi's kind of reading. It also reminded me, I think this is a quote from Desmond Tutu, where he said, when the white man came to Africa, we had the land and they had religion, and they told us to close our eyes and pray, and then when we open the eyes again,
the Bible and they had the land.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which seems, this scene seems to also like basically be telling the same story. But I also found it interesting that after that scene, we see the protagonist arrive in France, and he has the suitcase with the stickers on it, and it's like 5 or 6 different African countries, which also seems to me, I mean, this is a point that Abubakar made last week, that Matt Hondo never saw himself as belonging to one particular African country or speaking for one particular country's experience, but being a really Pan-African filmmaker. And I think that the suitcase with all the stickers of the different countries kind of also kind of points to that. We never, I think we very deliberately never learn like what country he comes from. He comes from Africa itself, in a sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
that.
I mean, my only response is that I absolutely agree. As I was saying, you know, in the opening address that I had, my sort of understanding of the work and very much how I perceive the work is that it's deeply Pan-African. It speaks both to the continent as it speaks to the diaspora as well, hence the unnaming of a specific location, because traces can be found of that shared experience everywhere. So yeah, very much so.
Thank you for your beautiful commentary of this beautiful film, which is so enjoyable to see on a big screen, a rare occasion also, in a sense. I was struck by how current this film is, or how actual that it is in the sort of French sense of the word, and also prophetic in a sense. The sort of attitude, mais vous avez votre indépendance, vous n'avez que rester chez vous. You have your independence now. Why don't you stay at, why do you stay? Why don't you stay back home? So reflected the situation last year, the natural catastrophe in Mayotte and Comoros, and the tension between a former French colony, which is Comoros, and the current French overseas territory, or actually department, Mayotte, which chose to remain in France, or a part of France, and Comoros, which chose to regain or gain its independence about the same time as this film was made. And the sort of Schadenfreude, very sort of pointed Schadenfreude of the French last year, when they sort of said, "Why are you, the immigrants from Comoros, coming over to Mayotte to reclaim the benefits of France? You should stay at your place. You chose independence, so also choose your misery." And the other sort of it's a commentary, two-part commentary. Another thing that this film made me think of was a film that was made pretty much at the same time, a few years later, as this film, and it's Petit à Petit by Jean Rouch, which almost seems to be a ethnographer's commentary of what this film is doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, France is interesting in many ways. That's to say the least. I mean, I think we can kind of decipher what I mean by that based on the film that we've seen today. It's worth also noting that this Hondo's film was banned in France for a whole decade after its release, which really says a lot about how destabilizing it was actually to the French government's psyche around their own benevolence in the context of their history, right? That a film could so provocatively completely destabilize the fallacy of the government so much that it would be banned in the country for a whole decade before it could actually be screened. And, you know, it remains so timely because it points to ongoing historical issues that are still persisting in France's relationship with the continent and its former colonies, but also France's relationship and engagement with immigrants even to this day, that very much can still be articulated in this film, even as it's been made several decades later. Yeah, so...
Yeah, we could do a whole program with films, French films and films made in France about colonialism that were banned.
Yeah.
And sometimes films from former colonies. You know, Bataille d'Algérie was banned for a long time. Les statues meurent aussi. So, you know, those are very virulent films. Afrique 50, yeah, that's true. Vautier. Yeah, I've been thinking about the complex geographies of the Caribbean in all this. And since you brought up Aimé Césaire, and since we've referenced Aimé Césaire several times, I mean, Césaire was, of course, part of the French educational system and the elite trajectory of education, because he was a Normalien and he was a teacher of classics, and so he was very much part of the French educational establishment. And then I was just thinking of the fact, first of all, Saint Lucia is the home of Audre Lorde, who is normally seen as an African-American intellectual and thinker, but she's actually a Caribbean artist and thinker. And then you have people like Edouard Glissant and Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who come from the French Caribbean realm, but come to prominence through the American educational and university system, and not through Paris. I mean, Glissant then publishes his books in Paris, and they have a big impact. But his career happens in the U.S., so those are very, very complex geographies that continue to evolve to this day.
Yeah, I mean, as happened to several others, like Maryse Condé as well. You know, her emergence was really in France, and she eventually left for the U.S. and she was a peer of Glissant, but it's not as widely recognized as a theorist as Glissant. But I mean, again, it's so interesting for me because France has produced so many incredible post-colonial thinkers and theorizers of the modern world who are looking to the Black Atlantic actually very much in their theorizing of what the modern world actually is and how it's formulated. And yet many of those same thinkers are not institutionally venerated in France, because the French institutional sphere itself cannot grapple with the confrontation of having to look inwards and really reflect upon itself with such unbridled fear to accept itself for what it really is. And that's why people like Césaire was never really able to find prominence even in France, despite how extensively he worked and lived there. It's why people like Glissant left eventually. It's why people like Maryse Condé also left, and many, many others. And speaking of Glissant, I've always thought it was so interesting to me that Glissant's really prominence to the international sphere came from the US.
Yes.
It was not through France. You know, it was his work in Colombia. Mantia Diao did extensive work with him for many, many years as well, and many others as well, including Hans Ulrich, who I worked under. But that's one of many people. And then I think of, the number of young writers coming to France from the African continent in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, who eventually also left.
Yeah.
And so there's a history of that, and this is still very much happening in the present moment as we speak, where a lot of Black French scholars and thinkers cannot find, I wouldn't say a safe space, but cannot find the grounding institutionally to be able to do their work because of the hostile environment that they operate in. Yeah.
I mean, it's now over 20 years old, but the Sortir de la Grande Nuit, Achille Mbembe, is fully in the last third of that book is about why there's no place for decolonial. Yeah. And Mbembe, as we know, is not a fan of decolonial and post-colonial theory, but he
never speaks about it.
Talks about the reasons why it never set foot in France. But one interesting thing, and this relates back to cinema, to me seems to be that there's more space for this kind of argument, discourse, imagination in literature in France than in theory. Starting with Kuruma and what's his name again from Senegal, the young writer who won
the one who just won the award a few years ago.
2-3 years ago. Mamadou Oumar Sarr. Sarr is the last name.
Why am I thinking of Bashir Dian? It's not Bashir Dian. No, sorry, the name is...
Yeah. Let me see. Memory. It's late in the day, so...
yes, very much so. I mean, I looked at the time and I was a bit shocked that it's almost midnight now. If I sound a bit tired, that's but I'm still here. But as you look for the name, no, I think in France, it's happening in terms of the art in France, but it's not happening institutionally. I think it's happening at much more informal, micro-level, independent platforms that you have young Black artists and curators running. So I wouldn't discredit it so much, saying these conversations and issues are not being grappled with publicly in France. Is being done, but it's not finding a space, at least within the wider dominant sphere of say white-led institutions, for example. But you do have independent spaces like La Colonie by Konaté, for example, was one space in Paris where that work was happening. And you have other younger, emerging, often racialized French cultural workers who are ensuring that there is a space for these complexities to be held in a public sphere. I mean, what I find so interesting with France is that, and agreed, so if we're looking to it being much more public facing, is happening through literature. But for example, in Scandinavia, having been raised in Copenhagen, it's actually the opposite. We're not seeing it in literature, but we're seeing it in the context of contemporary art. And that's why it interests me so much, because I find that the UK operates in the space between both of that.
Right.
You see it both in the literature, but you see it much more articulated, or both in literature, in theory, but also in contemporary art. And I find it interesting that when you're looking to the wider Black diaspora across Europe, for example, and the way in which that artists or cultural workers are trying to create nuances and looking transnationally in their shared commonalities of these struggles, there are many different iterations that it takes. So even in France and in Italy and in Spain, it's also happening through contemporary art. You might not see it in the literature, but you're seeing it in the visual arts production.
That's true. Mohamed Moubar Sarr.
Yes, that's it.
La plus secrète mémoire des hommes, Prix Goncourt, 2021, which, if you haven't read it, is a great book. But, I mean, that's like the highest consecration of the French cultural world for literature, is the Prix Goncourt. And if you win that, you're really part of the establishment. But it's also, interestingly, a novel that talks about an educational career along the lines of Senghor and Aimé Césaire. So this is someone who comes from a village and goes to elite school and shows great literary talent and promise and writes this incredible novel and then disappears. So it's also a literary fantasy about literature, and about literature as a mode of expression that comes to Africa through colonization and then is sort of appropriated by the colonial subject. But there seems to be more space in the arts and cinema. Also, someone like Yousam Palsy has a career in France and has a career in Hollywood at a time when Glisson and Trouillot don't get jobs in France. So, yeah. Okay. We could go on. But it's really late, and our dear projectionist, who I wish to thank for all the work they put in during the series, and for, this is the one event in the week's program that tires them most, because they have to stay up for so long because our audience is so committed to debate. And I wish to thank them and the Deutsches Filmmuseum, and thank you, Awa, for a wonderful program, a wonderful presentation, and a more than fitting conclusion to the whole series. Your final paragraph, we need to put it on the website. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. This continues in the winter term with a different topic. We're going to dedicate ourselves to Abbas Kiarostami for 2 terms. We think that it's time to think a little bit about the Middle East, and that's what we're going to do. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you next term.